There is a point where power no longer defines a man. It consumes him, not in spectacle, not in a single moment that can be witnessed and understood, but in the quiet erosion of certainty, in the slow collapse of identity, in the spaces where no one is watching and nothing can be hidden. By now, the empire still stands, but Sango does not stand within it the same way. The palace remains, but it feels different. Wider, colder. The courtyards that once carried the rhythm of movement, guards, messengers, and advisors, now hold a different presence. Silence. Not complete absence of sound, but the kind of silence that stretches between footsteps, that lingers after voices fade, that turns every movement into an echo. This is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of withdrawal. Because one by one, those who once filled these spaces have stepped back. Not entirely gone, but distant. Present only when necessary. Visible but not engaged. The structure remains intact, but its energy has shifted. And at the center of it all is Sango. Alone. Not by declaration, not by exile, but by consequence. This is where the conflict turns inward. Man versus himself. Because there are no longer external forces to confront. No enemies to defeat. No strategies to execute that can restore what has been lost. There is only reflection. And reflection for a man like Sango is not simple. Because what looks back at him is not a single identity. It is fractured. There is the king, the elephant who once commanded without resistance, who defined order, who enforced structure, who held the empire together through presence and authority. And then, there is something else, a version of himself shaped by everything that has happened, by the fire, by the destruction, by the fear that followed, by the distance that now surrounds him. These two identities do not align. They cannot, because one is rooted in control, and the other exists in its absence. This is where guilt begins to surface, not as a public admission, not as a visible acknowledgement, but as something internal, persistent, unresolved. It appears in moments where the silence becomes too heavy to ignore, where the absence of voices is louder than any command, where memory does not fade but repeats, images of what was lost, of what cannot be reversed. And with that guilt comes rage, not directed outward in the same way it once was, not focused on enemies or opposition, but inward, because the source of the conflict is no longer external. It is him. This creates a tension that has no clear release, because power, when turned inward, does not resolve conflict, it intensifies it. There are moments now where Sango's behavior becomes harder to interpret, not just for those around him but for himself. Actions that lack the precision he once maintained. Decisions that shift without clear reasoning. Reactions that arrive without warning. This is not the controlled intensity of a ruler enforcing authority. This is something else, something unstable, and instability at this level does not remain contained. It radiates. Those who remain near him, few as they are, feel it, in the way he speaks, in the way he moves, in the unpredictability that now defines his presence. The careful distance that others once maintained out of caution has now become a necessity, because proximity no longer offers clarity. It offers risk, and Sango is aware of it. He recognizes the distance. He senses the hesitation. He understands at some level that something fundamental has changed. But awareness does not restore control, because the deeper question remains unresolved. Who is he now? Is he still the king? The ruler defined by structure, by hierarchy, by the expectations of leadership? Or has he crossed into something else entirely? Something that no longer fits within the boundaries of human identity? This is not a philosophical question. It is a practical one, because identity determines action, and when identity fractures, action becomes inconsistent. There are moments where Sango appears to reclaim his role, measured, authoritative, composed. Brief returns to the structure that once defined him, but they do not last, because the other side remains present, persistent, unresolved, the part of him that has been shaped by power, by destruction, by the pursuit of something beyond human limitation. And that part does not yield easily. This creates a cycle. Control, then loss of control. Clarity, then confusion. Authority, then instability. Each phase reinforcing the next, each moment pulling him further from the balance he once maintained. The palace reflects this shift. Empty corridors, unused chambers, spaces that once held significance are now reduced to quiet observation. The physical structure remains unchanged, but its meaning has transformed. It is no longer a center of power. It is a reflection of it, or perhaps a reminder of what it used to be, because power, once destabilized, does not return to its original form. It changes, and so does the man who held it. For Sango, this is the final stage of internal conflict. Not a battle to be won, but a state to be endured, because there is no clear resolution, no external force to intervene, no system strong enough to recalibrate what has already shifted. There is only one remaining variable: choice. And choice in this context carries a different weight, because it is no longer about governance. It is no longer about authority. It is about identity, about what remains when everything else has been stripped away. And as this realization takes hold, as the silence deepens, as the distance becomes permanent, as the internal conflict reaches a point where it cannot be ignored, Sango approaches a decision, not impulsive, not reactive, but inevitable, because when a man stands between what he was and what he has become, there are only so many paths forward, and each one carries a consequence that cannot be undone. The palace remains still. The courtyards remain empty. The echoes of former power linger, but do not return. And within that stillness, within that isolation, within that unresolved tension, the final decision begins to form. But the final decision Sango made would define him forever. Every story of power, no matter how vast, moves toward a single, unavoidable point, the moment where nothing remains to command but the self. For Sango, that moment arrives without witnesses. No court assembled, no drums sounding, no generals standing in formation. The empire he once held together through force and presence continues beyond him, but he stands apart from it now, removed not by decree but by distance that cannot be crossed. The palace, once alive with movement, offers no resistance to his solitude. The corridors do not question him. The walls do not answer. Even the air feels still, as though the world itself has withdrawn, leaving him alone with what remains. This is where the accounts converge again, not in detail but in outcome. Sango reaches an end. The widely told version is direct. He takes his own life, not in spectacle, not in a display of power, but in isolation, a decision made beyond the reach of his kingdom, beyond the influence of those who once surrounded him. A final act that does not seek approval, does not seek validation, and does not seek to reinforce the image that defined him. It simply ends. This version carries weight because it confronts the contradiction at the center of his story. A king who inspired fear across an empire was brought to a point where no external force remained to confront him, where the only remaining conflict is internal and cannot be resolved through authority, through command, or through force. But this is not the only version that endures. There are others less direct, less final in appearance, but equally powerful in implication. In these accounts, Sango does not die in the conventional sense. He disappears, not as an act of escape, but as a transformation, a crossing from one state of existence into another. The man who once ruled as king does not simply end. He becomes something else entirely, something that cannot be confined to a single moment of death. In this interpretation, the absence is not emptiness. It is continuation. The thunder that follows, the lightning that strikes, the force that moves across the sky without warning. This is not separate from him. They are him, or at least they are understood to be. This version does not deny his end. It redefines it. But whether one accepts the traditional account or the mythological interpretation, one element remains constant across both. Sango is no longer present as he once was. The king is gone, and what remains is interpretation. This is where the emotional weight of his story reaches its peak. Because beneath the layers of power, beneath the expansion of empire, beneath the transformation from man to something greater or something more dangerous, there is a final image that cannot be avoided. A man, alone, not surrounded by enemies, not overthrown by rebellion, not defeated in battle, but isolated from everything that once defined him. This is the conclusion that reframes everything that came before it. Because if Sango's story ends in isolation, then power, no matter how absolute, did not protect him from that outcome. It led him there. And this is where the contradiction resolves, not through clarity, but through inevitability. The same force that elevated him separated him. The same authority that secured his rule weakened his connection to those around him. The same pursuit of dominance removed every external barrier until only one remained: himself. There are no witnesses to confirm his final moments. No record that captures the exact sequence of his last actions. Only the outcome, carried through generations in different forms, is shaped by belief, by memory, and by the need to understand what cannot be fully explained. But the absence of detail does not diminish the impact. It intensifies it, because it forces the focus onto what matters most. Not how he died, but what his death represents. The limit of power, the cost of isolation, the inevitability of internal conflict when it reaches a point where no external force can intervene. And within that understanding, one line remains simple, direct, unavoidable. The man who commanded thunder could not escape himself. History survives because someone chooses to remember. Across Africa, entire kingdoms rose and fell. Great rulers changed the course of nations. Warriors, scholars, inventors, queens, and visionaries shaped civilizations whose stories deserve to be told with accuracy, depth, and respect. Yet many of these stories remain unknown. Some have been forgotten. Others have been reduced to a few sentences when they deserve entire chapters. That is why Oyo Archives exists. Every video on this channel is part of a larger mission to uncover the people, empires, traditions, victories, mysteries, and turning points that helped shape Yoruba history and the history of Africa itself. If you believe these stories deserve to reach more people, take a moment to support this work. Click the like button. It tells YouTube that these histories matter. Share this video with friends, family, students, and anyone interested in learning about Africa beyond the versions often found in textbooks. And if you are passionate about discovering the untold stories of our past, subscribe to Oyo Archives and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Every like helps preserve history. Every share helps spread knowledge. Every subscription helps bring more forgotten stories back into the light. The archives are vast, and we are only beginning the journey. Subscribe now, and together, let us continue exploring the remarkable history, legends, empires, and cultural heritage of the Yoruba people and the African continent. This is Oyo Archives, where history is remembered, preserved, and brought to life.